It was a crisp evening when Jonathan Carter, the CEO of Carter Luxury Hotels, stepped out of his sleek black Rolls-Royce. The valet at the front of the Carter Grand Hotel hurried to open the door, offering a warm nod. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, Jonathan exuded the quiet confidence of a self-made man. He had built his empire from the ground up, turning a single struggling motel into a luxury hotel chain known across the country. But tonight, he wasn't here as the CEO. He wanted to experience his own hotel as a guest, to see how his staff treated people when they didn't know who they were serving. Jonathan walked through the grand entrance, the marble floors gleaming under the chandelier lights. The front desk was busy, with a few guests checking in. He adjusted his cufflinks and stepped forward. Behind the desk, Madison Harper, a young receptionist with an air of entitlement, barely glanced up. She was scrolling through her phone, lazily chewing gum. When she finally looked at Jonathan, her demeanor shifted. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped, almost dismissive. "Yes, I have a reservation," Jonathan said, placing his ID and credit card on the counter. Madison took them without much interest, her fingers tapping against the keyboard. A frown crept onto her face. I don't see a reservation under this name," she muttered. Jonathan remained calm. "That's strange. I booked it a week ago." Madison sighed dramatically and gave him a slow, judging look. "Are you sure you're at the right hotel?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "I'm very sure." She huffed, glancing at his expensive suit, then his dark skin. Her lips curled in slight amusement. "Well, I don't see your name here. Are you sure you can afford this place?" Jonathan's expression didn't change, but inside he felt a storm brewing. She had no idea who she was talking to. Jonathan kept his composure, but inside, he was taking note of every detail. This was his hotel, the place he built with his own hands, his own money. And here he was, being judged as if he didn't belong. Madison crossed her arms and exhaled loudly. "Look, sir, we don't usually take walk-ins this late, and no offense, but this is a 5-star hotel." Jonathan tilted his head. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" She smirked, eyeing him from head to toe, as if sizing him up. "I mean, we have a dress code, and our clientele is, well, a certain type." Jonathan chuckled under his breath. A certain type. He knew exactly what she was implying. "So, because I don't fit your image of the kind of person who stays here, you assume I don't belong?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. Madison shrugged. "Hey, I'm just saying. We get a lot of people trying to sneak in, thinking they can afford luxury. You'd be surprised how many just waste our time." Jonathan clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to lose his temper, not yet. He wanted to see how far this would go. "What if I told you I could afford any room in this hotel?" he said, leaning slightly closer. Madison scoffed. "Sure, and I'm the Queen of England." She looked at his credit card again. "Declined guests always say that." Jonathan chuckled again, but this time it was out of sheer disbelief. Was she really this ignorant? He leaned back, slipping his phone from his pocket. Time to play along. "All right," he said smoothly. "Why don't you go ahead and run that card? Let's see if I belong here or not." Madison rolled her eyes and slid the card into the machine, completely unaware of the mistake she was about to make. Madison tapped her long nails impatiently on the counter as the card machine processed the payment. Her smug expression didn't waver. She had already convinced herself that the card would decline, proving her point. Jonathan stood there watching her closely, his hands in his pockets. He already knew what was coming. Beep! Madison's eyes widened slightly. She looked down at the screen. Transaction approved. She blinked, tilting the screen slightly as if she had misread it. "Wait, that can't be right," she muttered under her breath, pressing a few buttons to double-check. But there it was, in bold letters. Paid, $2,500, presidential suite. Jonathan smirked. "Something wrong?" Madison's face twisted in confusion. She looked back up at him, her arrogance flickering. "How?" Jonathan reached forward and casually picked up the room key she had placed on the counter for someone more worthy. He flipped it between his fingers. "Oh, don't worry," he said smoothly. "I'll be taking the best suite you have." Madison forced a smile, her tone shifting into fake politeness. I didn't realize," Jonathan cut her off. "Didn't realize what? That I could afford it? That I belong here?" She swallowed hard. I assumed. You assumed I was beneath this place." He finished for her. Madison's cheeks flushed red. She opened her mouth to argue, but Jonathan held up a hand. "No need to explain," he said, shaking his head. "I get it all the time. You judged me by my looks, not my status. But here's the real problem." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I own this hotel." Madison's breath caught in her throat. Her entire world had just crumbled in an instant. Madison's face went completely pale. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she could barely hear anything else. "You... what?" she whispered, her voice barely coming out. Jonathan set the room key down on the counter with a soft clink and folded his arms. "You heard me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I own this hotel." Madison's breath hitched. She looked around frantically, as if hoping someone would jump in and tell her it was a joke. But the lobby was silent. Other guests had noticed the tension, whispering to one another, eyes darting back and forth between her and Jonathan. "Sir, she stammered, but she had no idea how to finish the sentence. Jonathan's sharp gaze locked onto hers. "Let me ask you something, Madison," he said smoothly. "What made you think I didn't belong here?" "I didn't. I mean..." Madison was stumbling over her words, her confidence completely shattered. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Right. You just assumed." He let the word linger in the air. "Tell me, do you treat all your guests like this, or just the ones who don't look like they can afford to stay here?" Madison's lips trembled. "Sir, I didn't mean..." "Oh, you meant it," Jonathan interrupted, his tone sharp. "You meant every word, every glance, every smug little smirk." The other hotel employees were now frozen in place, wide-eyed. The front desk manager, a man in his 50s named Richard, had just stepped out of the office and was listening in with sheer horror on his face. Jonathan turned his head slightly toward him. "Richard," he said coolly, "is this how your employees are trained to treat guests?" Richard's face turned red. "Sir, I had no idea." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Oh, we'll see about that." He turned back to Madison, whose hands were now shaking. She had made the biggest mistake of her career, and she was about to pay for it. Richard rushed forward, his face drenched in sweat. He could feel the weight of every guest's stare, the murmurs spreading like wildfire. "Mr. Reynolds, sir, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "Madison is still in training and..." "In training?" Jonathan cut him off, raising an eyebrow. "So, you're telling me that discrimination is part of the training here?" Madison's breath hitched. No, I wasn't discriminating. You just assumed I didn't belong," Jonathan finished for her. His voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable authority. "And now your boss is scrambling to cover for you." Richard swallowed hard. "Mr. Reynolds, I assure you, we hold our employees to the highest standards of professionalism. This will be handled internally." Jonathan let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Internally?" He shook his head. "No, see, that's the problem. Situations like this get handled internally and nothing changes." Richard's face turned a deeper shade of red. I understand your frustration, sir. Please allow me to offer you a complimentary suite for the duration of your stay." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "You think a free room is going to fix this?" The lobby had fallen into complete silence. Even the bellhops and concierge staff were frozen in place, holding their breath. Madison looked like she wanted to disappear. Her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. I didn't mean any harm," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jonathan tilted his head. "Tell me something, Madison," he said. "If I had been wearing a suit, would you have questioned me? If I looked like one of your typical high-paying guests, would you have assumed I was out of place?" Madison had no answer, because deep down, she knew the truth. Richard cleared his throat, desperate to regain control of the situation. "Sir, perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office?" Jonathan gave him a long, hard look. Then, with deliberate slowness, he nodded. "Fine, but understand this. I'm not just another guest. This is my hotel, and I expect every person who walks through these doors to be treated with the respect they deserve." Richard nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Right this way." Jonathan cast one last glance at Madison before turning and following Richard toward the office. Madison exhaled shakily, her whole body trembling. She had no idea what was about to happen next. Inside Richard's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The walls were lined with awards, framed newspaper articles, and photos of Richard shaking hands with influential figures. But none of that mattered now. Richard gestured toward a leather chair. Please, Mr. Reynolds, have a seat. Jonathan remained standing. I'll stand, he said coolly. Richard swallowed hard. Sir, I truly regret what just happened. Madison, she's new, and this was a terrible mistake on her part. I'll make sure she's disciplined. Jonathan folded his arms. Disciplined? His tone was sharp. That's the best you can do? You saw what happened out there, Richard. She looked me up and down, sized me up, and decided I didn't belong. That's not just a mistake. That's a mindset. Richard fumbled for words. I understand, and I assure you, this is not a reflection of our hotel's values. Jonathan let out a dry laugh. Really? Because if it wasn't, then why did she feel so comfortable treating me like that? I wonder how many other guests she's judged based on how they look. Richard wiped his forehead. Sir, please. No, Richard. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice low and firm. I built this hotel from the ground up. My name is on the deed. My reputation is tied to every experience a guest has here. And today I was humiliated in my own hotel. Richard's eyes darted around the room, desperate for a way out of the conversation. I can fire her immediately if you wish. Jonathan studied him for a long moment. Firing her doesn't fix the culture you've allowed to grow here, he said. This isn't just about one employee. It's about the environment you've fostered. Richard hesitated, unsure how to respond. Jonathan continued, I want every employee retrained immediately, and not just a basic sensitivity training session. I want real education on bias, on respect, on professionalism. Richard nodded quickly. Of course, sir, whatever you think is best. Jonathan took a step closer, and I want to talk to Madison myself. Richard hesitated. You want to speak with her? Yes, Jonathan said firmly, because if she's going to keep working in my hotel, she needs to understand exactly what kind of place this is, and what kind of leader I am. Richard had no choice but to agree. A few moments later, he picked up the phone and made the call. Madison was about to face the consequences of her actions, and she had no idea what was coming next. Madison sat in the employee lounge, her hands trembling as she gripped her phone. The events of the past hour replayed in her mind like a nightmare. She had made a huge mistake, one that could cost her everything. When the phone rang, she nearly dropped it. Madison, come to Mr. Lockwood's office immediately, the voice on the other end said. Her heart pounded as she made her way down the hall. She had never been called to Richard Lockwood's office before, let alone to face the owner of the entire hotel chain. When she entered, the atmosphere was suffocating. Richard sat behind his massive desk, his face pale. But it was the man standing near the window who made her breath hitch. Jonathan Reynolds turned slowly, his gaze sharp, unwavering. Madison felt like she was shrinking under the weight of it. Sit, Jonathan said. She obeyed without question. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Jonathan spoke. Do you know who I am? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Madison swallowed hard. Yes, sir, I do now. And yet, when I walked in earlier, you assumed I was a nobody, Jonathan continued. Why? Madison's throat went dry. I don't know. Jonathan didn't look away. You don't know, or you don't want to admit it? Tears burned at the back of her eyes. I swear, sir, I didn't mean any harm. I wasn't expecting. She stopped herself. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. You weren't expecting a black man to be wealthy? To be the owner? Madison opened her mouth, but shut it again. There was no good answer. Richard cleared his throat. Mr. Reynolds, I assure you Madison's actions don't reflect the values of this hotel. Jonathan ignored him. Tell me, Madison, if I had been a white man in a designer suit, would you have questioned whether I belonged? The silence was damning. Madison shook her head, ashamed. No, sir, I wouldn't have. Jonathan nodded. That's what I thought. He took a deep breath. So tell me, why should I allow you to continue working in my hotel? Madison's heart pounded. I'll do better. I swear. Please, Mr. Reynolds, I love this job. I didn't mean to disrespect you. Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Words mean nothing without action. I need to know that you're willing to change. Madison nodded frantically. I am. I'll do anything. Jonathan exhaled, his decision already made. I'm going to give you a choice, he said. You can resign right now, or you can stay, but under one condition. Madison clung to the last bit of hope. Anything, sir. I'll do anything. Jonathan folded his arms. You're going to learn what it truly means to serve every guest with respect, And you're going to start by working where people like me are often ignored, the housekeeping department. Madison's breath caught. Housekeeping? Yes, Jonathan said firmly. You'll spend the next 3 months there, understanding the value of every worker, no matter who they are. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, but deep down she knew she had no choice. She nodded. I accept. Jonathan gave a single nod. Then let's see if you really mean it. The next morning, Madison stood in the housekeeping supply room, wearing a plain uniform instead of her crisp receptionist attire. Her hair was pulled back, her nails were unpolished, and for the first time since she started working at the Grand Crest Hotel, she felt completely invisible. Grab a cart and follow me, said Carmen, the head of housekeeping, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and years of experience. Madison hesitated before obeying, the weight of the moment sinking in. She wasn't behind a polished desk anymore. She wasn't greeting wealthy guests with a rehearsed smile. She was pushing a cleaning cart, about to scrub toilets. Carmen led her to the first room. All right, newbie, time to get to work. Madison's stomach churned as she stepped inside. The suite was in disarray. Unmade bed, used towels on the floor, room service trays covered in half-eaten food. Carmen handed her a pair of gloves. Strip the bed, replace the sheets, scrub the bathroom, and don't forget to check under the bed. Guests leave all kinds of surprises. Madison swallowed her pride and got to work. Within minutes, sweat formed at her brow. Changing sheets wasn't as easy as she'd thought, and the bathroom, she grimaced, was a disaster. Carmen watched her struggle. Not so easy, huh? Madison shook her head. Not at all. Funny, Carmen mused. Receptionists usually don't think about the people who make these rooms spotless before they check in, but without us, this hotel wouldn't run. Madison bit her lip. She had spent years walking past housekeeping staff without giving them a second thought. Now, she was one of them. By the end of her first shift, her arms ached, her back hurt, and she had a new understanding of exhaustion. Carmen handed her a bottle of water. You survived day 1. Let's see if you last the week. Madison wiped her forehead, realizing this was just the beginning. Madison's second day in housekeeping was even harder. Her arms ached from scrubbing floors, her back was sore from changing heavy sheets, and her feet throbbed from walking endless hallways. But the worst part? The way people ignored her. Guests barely glanced at her as they walked past, some even avoiding eye contact as if she were invisible. A businessman on a phone call had walked into his suite while she was cleaning and didn't even acknowledge her presence. It was humiliating. By lunchtime, she slumped onto a bench in the employee break room, exhausted. Carmen sat beside her, sipping coffee. You still here? She asked with a smirk. Madison sighed. Barely. Carmen chuckled. You know, I was watching you yesterday. You worked hard, sloppy, but you tried. Madison scoffed. I was awful. Carmen shrugged. Maybe, but you didn't quit. That's something. For the first time, Madison smiled. It was small, but real. Just then, the break room TV flickered on, showing a live news segment. The headline caught everyone's attention. Black CEO's secret social experiment shakes luxury hotel industry. Madison's heart pounded. The screen showed Mr. Carter standing at a press conference. I wanted to see how my own employees are treated when they aren't wearing a suit, he said. I wanted to expose the biases that still exist, even in spaces meant for professionalism and hospitality. Carmen turned to Madison. Wait, you were the receptionist when this happened, right? Madison felt heat rise to her face. The entire hotel staff knew about the incident. Her mistake had made national news. The CEO continued. Everyone deserves respect, no matter what they wear, no matter their job. And that's the lesson here. Madison swallowed hard. This wasn't just about her anymore. The hotel was buzzing. Staff huddled around phones, whispering about the news. Guests discussed the CEO's experiment over breakfast. The story had gone viral, and Madison was at the center of it. She rushed back to the front desk, feeling every pair of eyes on her. Whispers followed her like shadows. She's the one who turned him away. Did she really think he was just some guy off the street? Man, I'd be so embarrassed. Her hands trembled as she straightened her uniform. She had worked hard for this job, but now it felt like she was one mistake away from losing everything. Then a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. Miss Reynolds. She turned slowly. Mr. Carter stood there, calm yet commanding. His presence made the entire lobby go silent. Sir, she swallowed, searching for words. I'm so sorry. He held up a hand. Let's talk in my office. Every step to his office felt like a walk toward judgment. Once inside, he gestured for her to sit. You made a mistake, he said. A big one, but the bigger problem is why it happened. Madison clenched her hands. I assumed things I shouldn't have. I judged based on appearance. Carter nodded. You're not the only one. That's why I did this. He leaned forward. Madison, do you want to grow from this or run from it? Tears burned her eyes. I want to grow. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's start. Madison let out a shaky breath. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation like this? Let's talk about the importance of respect, equality, and judging people by their character, not their appearance. Subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change.